Welcome to the last talk this semester in our series on American literature. This time we'll be covering the sixth era that you'll need to know about, modernism.
Oh, right. At last, some stuff from today.
Well, not quite. It was modern at the time, and the name just stuck. And the dates are not absolute marking points either. They just give you the general time period.
Oh, it's from the beginning of the First World War to the end of the Second.
Again, almost but not quite. The First World War began in 1914, and the war did visibly break up the old order of things in politics and society. But the seeds of change have been in the air for some time already. For our purposes, 1912 will work. Some say 1912 because this is when Ezra Pound first began popularizing imagist poetry. The idea was a break with the past. Pound claimed that poetry should look at the image itself as clearly as possible and at nothing else. But perhaps a better illustration of modernist ideas was at the Armory Art Exhibit in 1913, which introduced modernism to America. Take a look at this image and tell me what you see.
What the hell?
It's called Nude Descending a Staircase, and it blew people away when they first saw it. Look at the picture closely, and you can see that it really is a nude woman descending a staircase. It's based on what was then a new technology, film. People were used to seeing a single unitary image, but this was presenting audiences with a whole new way of looking at things. Industrial life was challenging the old order of the world, and modernism attempted to represent the way it was changing life. The stability seen in classical forms was no longer relevant for everyone. Modernism was present in many different fields as well. You can see it with cubists such as Picasso in the art world, or Stravinsky's bizarre new, almost industrial-sounding symphonies in music. Sigmund Freud's ideas about psychology and the unconscious shattered the concept of a stable self. And Albert Einstein's theory of relativity even changed how we looked at time. It made time, well, relative. In literature, this meant a break with past forms, a lot of experimentation, and a tendency towards fragmentation. New techniques, such as stream of consciousness, free verse, and non-chronological narratives were developed.
Wasn't free verse already around in the 19th century?
You're right. Walt Whitman died long before the art show in 1913. But the ideas of modernism, like the Industrial Revolution, didn't start up all at one time. The era of modernism begins for us when these ideas became dominant in the world of art and literature. We don't have time this semester to do complete justice to all the American modernist writers, but I'd like to take a quick look at three: Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and William Faulkner. Hemingway was born in Chicago in 1899, but spent little of his life there. At age 18, he joined the Italian Ambulance Corps and was severely wounded by an artillery shell, spending months convalescing in a hospital. Later, unable to fit into life in the U.S. again, he got a job as a journalist and spent several years in Paris, perfecting the deceptively simple journalistic writing style that he would make famous. In 1926, he published his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, a depiction of the lost generation, English-speaking expatriates living in Paris, traveling to bullfights in Pamplona, Spain, and seemingly living aimlessly from moment to moment.
If they were in Paris, how could they be lost?
It was meant metaphorically and referred to those who had been so traumatized by the war that they couldn't believe in anything anymore. The phrase, told to Hemingway by an older American writer, came to refer to both a group of writers and an entire generation devastated by the war. The novel, along with a collection of short stories, made Hemingway famous, and he left Paris in 1928 and moved around frequently, hunting in Africa, fishing in Key West, visiting Spain during its Civil War, and living in Cuba later. He published numerous short stories and novels in this period, including A Farewell to Arms about a soldier wounded in the war, For Whom the Bell Tolls about an American participating in the Spanish Civil War, and The Old Man and the Sea in 1952.
I had to read that one for school.
That novel won him the Nobel Prize, although by this time much of his writing had lost its power. His fame had turned him into somewhat of a caricature, and his writing reflected that. The Old Man and the Sea was a last return to his former style. And that is what made him famous. Good writing, he said, was like an iceberg. What you read are lots of short, simple declarative sentences, but there is a lot going on beneath the surface. You'll also note that much of his writing is about people like himself in similar situations. He writes about what he knows. The protagonist is always a man about his age doing things he has done. This can be a strength, but for some readers it's a limitation. Hemingway led a colorful life, and lots of that color found its way into his novels and stories, making him a popular writer. But it is also his writing style which revolutionized American literature. One person Hemingway knew back in Paris in the 1920s was F. Scott Fitzgerald, who he liked but had a complicated relationship with. Fitzgerald, however, is less associated with the lost generation and more seen in connection with the term the Jazz Age, a phrase he coined in his 1920 novel, This Side of Paradise. Fitzgerald was born in 1896 in Minnesota, but, like Hemingway, quickly left the Midwest behind. He enlisted in the military, though he never served in the World War itself. He was living in New York when his first novel, This Side of Paradise, was published, and it quickly made him famous. The novel portrays the loose morality and partying lifestyle of the new generation coming of age after the war. Publication also helped him win the hand of a rich girl he had been pursuing, Zelda Sayer, who was a model for Daisy in The Great Gatsby. Together, they lived that hard drinking and partying lifestyle.
All right, Scotty.
They continued this lifestyle in France, where life was cheaper than in the U.S., and where Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. What is today considered the great American novel was actually written in Europe. In Gatsby, you'll find modernism in the alienation the narrator and other characters experience, and in the nonlinear, almost fragmented narration style. But we'll talk about that more in the seminar. At any rate, Fitzgerald and his wife returned to the U.S. a year after The Great Gatsby was published, but the hard partying lifestyle soon took its toll. By 1930, Zelda had a nervous breakdown and was diagnosed with schizophrenia and finally put in a mental institution. Fitzgerald then lived in Hollywood for a while, earning more money than he had for writing novels and short stories, but eventually died in 1940 of a heart attack. His life mirrored American society at the time. His life was roaring during the Roaring Twenties, and when the Great Depression hit, he too fell apart. The stint in Hollywood was also a typical modern phenomenon. Many famous and talented writers ended up there, including Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, John Steinbeck, Raymond Chandler, and William Faulkner, our last writer for today. Faulkner was born in Oxford, Mississippi in 1897, tried to join the Canadian Air Force, but, like Fitzgerald, never fought in the war. He then spent some time in New Orleans trying to launch a writing career. He eventually returned to his hometown and transformed it into the center stage of his writing. He created the fictional county of Yoknapatawpha, using his hometown as a model for it. Much of the writing he produced used this county as the setting.
That's kind of like what Stephen King did with Maine and his horror stories, isn't it?
You're darn right, and it worked for him, too. But he didn't just write gossip about the town and county. Most of his works explore human nature and the conflicts inside Southern society, white, black, Indian, and rich and poor. In fact, that's what made him so popular in the rest of the U.S. He tried to reveal the nature of a part of the country most Americans had turned their backs on after the Civil War, the South. He turned out a string of novels starting in 1929 that are some of the best an American writer has ever produced. They are also some of the more complicated ones, too. He was more experimental than the other two modernists we've talked about today.
How complicated are we talking about here?
Well, stream of consciousness writing, interesting multiple narrative perspectives, and at times very difficult syntax. In fact, this is what Hemingway had to say about Faulkner. Hemingway did have a sense of humor. But one should remember that a challenging book also means that the author respects your intelligence.
Yeah, right.
At any rate, the books didn't sell all that well, despite the respect he received in academia, and Faulkner later turned to writing for Hollywood. Check the credits for some of those films from the 30s and 40s, and you'll find Faulkner's name there, including for the film version of one of Hemingway's novels. And that wraps up our discussion of modernism. There is, of course, more to this era than just these three writers, so this was just a brief overview. We'll talk more about this era and read some other writers next semester in the seminar.
I just want to finish this semester.
And we just did. Those are the 6 eras you'll need to know for the test, covering 1492 to 1945. Review them as necessary, and I'll see you there at the test.